Welcome back to JNS. I'm here with my old friend, William Daroff, who is the CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. It is the umbrella organization for American Jewry. And you are here now ahead of what is, I believe, the 50th mission of the Conference of Presidents.
Yes, it is our 50th annual mission. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Alex, and to be with JNS.
Welcome.
And wonderful to be back home in Israel.
Yeah, and you're a frequent visitor here to the Jewish state. How many times have you been here really since October 7th?
This is my 11th trip since October 7th.
And what do you do here when you come?
Mostly it's sort of twofold. A lot of it has been giving hugs and getting hugs back, showing the people of Israel that American Jewry stands with them. And as I said, going throughout Gaza, going the Gaza Seam and going seeing evacuees from the north and elsewhere, here to comfort. More often than not, we're the ones who get comforted by the resilient and stalwart Israelis who have been dealing with the crisis. And then beyond that, working with your political figures here, with the government officials, to ensure that the conversation between our two governments is going in the right way and that the views of American Jewry are being well expressed, and likewise that we understand where the government's coming from.
I was just in Washington, D.C. this past week with the Prime Minister's delegation, and the sense among at least the Israeli officials was that the relationships between the two governments are set to go on a pretty smooth path.
It was a very positive week of meetings between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump and others in the Trump administration. And I do believe that there's great synergy and convergence of views on a number of key issues that is positive. I think that the closer America and Israel are, the safer America and Israel are, and the closer that the American leadership and the Israeli leadership are, the safer America and Israel are.
You know, I couldn't help when I was looking at these two meetings, and I was in the Oval Office just ahead of the meeting and watching the two teams come in, and obviously the American team. But when you look at the Israeli team, who's sitting there? I mean, first of all, the Prime Minister has spent a lot of time, went to high school in the United States. Right. And then you have Minister of Strategic Affairs, who's more or less Israel's vice president right now, who grew up in Miami Beach. You have Ofer Falk, who I believe spent a lot of time in Chicago, I think. Right. And you have Carolyn Glick, who used to be the JNS senior contributing editor and the host of the Carolyn Glick Show here, who's now just taken a job as the international affairs advisor for Netanyahu. And then you have Yechiel Leiter, who was just appointed ambassador to the United States, all of whom are American born.
Yechiel grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
So you see that the Israeli team literally does speak the same language. You have political conservatives sitting together with American-born political conservatives, and you really feel that they are able to see eye to eye and speak the same language.
Yeah, absolutely. But there was a connection to begin with between the American people and the Israeli people, and there's certainly a connection at the political level. And Prime Minister Netanyahu comes to this as someone who is an icon. Most people who are a little bit younger than me can't remember there being another prime minister, and I think that status is something that really lifts him up as it relates to American government officials in the Trump administration and elsewhere.
Now, I'll ask the controversial question because, let's just get to the serious questions over here. The prime minister was criticized because he did not sit down to meet with American Jewish leaders. Back in July, when he addressed the joint sessions of Congress, he did scheduled two meetings. One was with evangelical Christian leaders, and the other was with American Jewish leaders. This time, he did take a meeting in the Blair House with Christian evangelical leaders, but for whatever reason, we don't really have an explanation. He decided not to meet with the American Jewish leaders.
Well, that is correct. He did meet with us the last number of times that he's been in America, including the trip you mentioned in Washington, and then when he was in New York as well, with various sets of with American Jewish leaders. We also meet with him here in Israel, and in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be speaking at the Conference of Presidents in less than 10 days, about even less than that at the end of the week. And that dialogue is something that will be encouraging and something that happens a lot. As far as this trip, I wish we had met. It's something that we had talked to the Prime Minister's office and the embassy about, and there was dialogue really until about the middle of the trip when it became clear that the trip wasn't, that the meeting was not going to happen. The schedule was tight. They were looking at the Friday, but as you know, Friday with Shabbat is tough, particularly with a number of American Jewish leaders coming from New York.
Also, Mike Johnson was supposed to meet with the prime minister on Thursday, and that didn't happen. Then it was moved to Friday.
Right.
They had a briefing with American press, of which I was able to go and ask a question. It was excellent, and there were several other meetings that day.
So I wish there had been a meeting, but there will be many more meetings to come, including one this coming Sunday.
But the prime minister has really spoken just about every single year that I can remember. I've been invited
to the Conference of Presidents?
Yeah,
Yes.
I've been invited to many conferences over the years. I must be getting older now, and I think the prime minister also usually speaks very freely for the conference. It usually comes without notes. I mean, one time I saw he gave a great PowerPoint presentation on the growth of Israel's GDP and how that's really turned Israel into a military power.
Yes.
But usually comes very comfortable with the Jewish leaders, speaks, extemporaneously. And what do you expect to hear from the prime minister this time?
Well, this will be, as I said, it's our 50th annual mission. We have pictures of prime ministers addressing the conference for 50 years, Levi Eshkol and Golda, and a lot from Bibi, since he's been there so many years, as you can attest.
It's probably his 16th time.
We should count and see. He was, you mentioned the Blair House. He is the foreign leader who has stayed at the Blair House more than any other.
He stayed 14 times at the Blair House. And I just saw from the prime minister's office that this was his 20th meeting at the White House.
That's amazing. I wonder who number 2 is at the Blair House, because it's longevity. I wonder if Churchill had more than 3. It speaks to his longevity. And we anticipate that, as usual, he will make some news. This will be his first address for sure to an American audience, and maybe his first public address since returning from America to an audience, and certainly his first address to the American Jewish community since returning to America. So we expect to hear more about the meeting, more about where things stand relative to the conflict. And as you can attest, also, it's been very much a moving target as far as the news cycle, with lots of news happening. And there is a great deal of media in Israel right now, and we're receiving many, many more inquiries from media wanting to cover the event than usual.
Here in Israel, prior to October 7th, the situation was not pleasant, to say the least. There was a lot of infighting, mostly centered around the judicial reforms package that the prime minister was introducing. But you could tell that there was something even deeper than the judicial reforms, and it had been building up. And obviously, having 5 election cycles in 5-year period, it doesn't really help. We saw a lot of political polarization. But parallel to that, we also saw that there was a rift seeming to develop between the administration here in Israel and American Jewish leaders. And, over the years, American Jewish leaders have been somewhat critical of Israeli policies. But what we saw here in Israel on October 7th was that the situation forced the society to unite. And I would say also that from here, at least, it looks very impressive the way the American Jewish community galvanized to support the war effort. I believe something between $1.5 million and $1.5 billion and $2 billion were raised to support, whether it was vests and helmets for soldiers and everything else. And a sense, I think, among American Jewry that their fate is tied to the state of Israel in some way. So can you tell me a little bit about what the response to October 7th has been in the United States and how that's helped to repair the relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. On October 7th, we in American Jewry received a punch in the gut when we saw the vicious Hamas terror attack here. Shortly thereafter, we had a second punch in the gut when we looked to our left and our right, to our erstwhile allies and friends who we had stood with and marched with and advocated with and lobbied with, and saw that they weren't there with us, that they were minimizing and denying and making excuses for Hamas's crimes. And I think that second punch in the gut, along with the increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts, which is closely related to the October 7th attacks and the anti-Israel animus that's out there, forced us as a Jewish community to look inward, to realize that since most of our neighbors, and there were some neighbors who were there and are still there, and thank God that they're there, and kol hakavod to those who stood and stand with us.
Well,
But
I just want to interrupt you for a second.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned some of your neighbors weren't there, some of your neighbors were. Can you elaborate a little bit on who those neighbors were?
Sure. Feminist organizations, African American organizations, Latino organizations, student groups, faculty members, just in general, people that we thought were our friends. And when we turned to look in their front doors, they had a sign out that made clear that they weren't our friends, or they were marching, or they were encamping, or they weren't issuing statements. Just sort of the sort of larger body of civil society that we expected would be there with
You'd
us.
invested a lot of time and energy into those communities.
Absolutely. And it's not just the organizations, but it's coworkers too. I mean, I know I have a doctor that I go to who talks about how she has all sorts of clients, a Jewish doctor, who has all sorts of patients who come in from their workplaces who feel like she's the only person they can talk to because they feel squeezed in their office about what's happening on Al Jazeera, what's happening on TikTok, and people putting, was it pumpkins? Not pumpkins, watermelons on their desks. And otherwise, there's to some extent people that, again, on big level and small level, who expect to be with us weren't with us. That being said, again, there are many who were there with us and are there with us, particularly a number of political figures and others within those communities who are. And we can come back to to our erstwhile allies. But what I believe that this did is it created a recognition by American Jews that two things. One, the importance of Israel to who we are, and how much that punch in the gut hurt from October 7th and thereafter. And secondly, that at the end of the day, we as a Jewish people need to only count on the Jewish community, that it is Jews who we know will stand there with us together, and that we're only as strong as we are unified. And so I think those coming together have made us a stronger community, have made the bonds between America and Israel stronger, and between American Jewry and Israel and Israelis stronger, and have also led to a resurgence of sorts of American Jewish life and engagement, where there is more synagogue attendance, more JCC attendance, more people engaged in advocacy on behalf of Israel. I think it's been a reawakening of sorts.
And one that's been triggered in some way by the growing anti-Semitism in the United States.
For certain, that many thought that we were in an era where we had gotten past that. It is the 21st century. And that realization that Jew hatred is out there more than ever, that the caps are off the sewers and they're overflowing, certainly brings us home. It's this idea that if I'm not living Jewishly, maybe I'm exempt from it, but even Jews who aren't living Jewishly are getting slammed in the streets of Brooklyn, slammed on the campuses of America, slammed in the news media. And so I think it also brought about this epiphany of sorts.
And what have been some of the pivots that have been most successful, most surprising, some of the best initiatives that you've seen so far in response to all of this?
About combating anti-Semitism in general? I mean, I think a lot of the focus on the universities has been incredibly helpful. Getting the U.S. Department of Education under President Biden, now under President Trump, to very much focus on Title VII complaints, on complaints about Jews not being able to study or live or work freely as Jews on campus. The Biden administration very much turned up the heat with many, many investigations. The Trump administration, just in the last week, has announced 5 new investigations, and for the first time ever, isn't waiting for complaints to be filed, but is proactively engaging, which I think is a game changer. On the campuses, the university administrators needed to recognize that the path of last resistance was not to allow for the pro-Hamas crowd to get whatever they wanted. And there was a multi-front effort on that, and still is, with congressional figures, with alumni, with others who are active in civil engagement, to try to change the equation so that the universities recognize that the problem were these students who were violating the rules, rather than those who are trying to keep the students from violating the rules. And so by having enforcement there, I think that's a game changer too. And we've seen a lessening of the surus, a lessening of the conflict on college campuses this year. And I think in large part it's because of that.
Is more being done to prepare students for what they might come to expect, unfortunately, on the university campuses?
So there's an effort to focus on students before they get to colleges, to focus on high school, to focus on middle school, the thinking being that, as you say, that the first time they should learn about the conflict shouldn't be at the opening falafel dinner on orientation weekend at campus. And there's a major focus by a number of Jewish organizations on that piece. But it's really, the onus here shouldn't be on the students. Jewish kids don't go to campus to be warriors for Zion. They go to do whatever it is college kids do, learn Shakespeare, figure out how much beer they can drink, find a spouse. But because of the circumstances that we're in, they've really become warriors, and it's unfortunate. And I wish that we as a community had done more to prepare them and to prepare society and to ensure that colleges and universities didn't pivot as far away as they did. But I'm hopeful that there's a pivot back and that we see the pendulum that really put all of the instrumentalities of universities out there in opposition to Jewish students, to pro-Israel students, that pendulum is swinging back.
Until now, obviously, Jewish families in particular always thought that it's super important for their kids to go to the best college possible. Is there discussion now about whether it's worth the money now to send their children to these universities if, number one, the education levels are declining, and then number two, that they're going to be bullied for being Jewish?
There certainly is a lot of discussion among parents about those schools, particularly the Ivy League schools that have been so problematic. And I think that there has been a retrenchment of sorts. I haven't seen recent numbers, but there were numbers for the last application cycle where particularly students from Jewish day schools are not applying to those sets of Ivies the way that they had. Hopefully, again, like alumni contributors, like congressional pressure, if there are decreases in the most brilliant students who happen to be Jewish not going to these schools, hopefully that'll have impact. There are schools that are out there that are trying to focus on Jewish students and to try to bring them in, recognizing the problem that has been there with the elites. And I think that's great for there to be competition. And there are amazing schools here in Israel. And I think it's notwithstanding the
and
conflict,
a lot cheaper.
And it is much, much cheaper, absolutely, for parents to be here. A number of great opportunities. And if you serve in the Army, then you can get college for free.
It's a question that a lot of parents may think twice about sending their American kids to go serve in the Israeli Army, especially after what we've seen this year. It's not an easy decision to take.
It's not, but it's interesting you bring it up. I've talked to so many, I'm involved with Nefesh B'Nefesh, and I've talked to so many Olim who have talked about how they've talked to their children who didn't make a choice to make Aliyah. They're either born here or they came when they were 2 or 3, and as good Jewish parents feeling guilty. Alex, I'm so sorry that, I put you in the middle of this war. And I've literally heard from every one of them how their kids want to slap their parents and say, "What are you talking about, Abba? If I wasn't here, I'd try to figure out a way to get here. This is exactly the place for me to be. Thank God you made Aliyah so I could be here with my people." And I think that that's a feeling that's very strong in Zionist circles, obviously here, but in America as well.
Do you expect that there'll be an increase in Aliyah, American Jews moving to Israel in the coming years?
I think once this present conflict calms down a bit and the Houthis are no longer waking people up at 4 o'clock in the morning, I think there will be a movement of Aliyah. I think that the path ahead, I'm an optimist. I think as a Jew, you have to be an optimist. If we weren't optimists, we never would have left Sinai. We never would have left the shtetl. We never would have left the Upper East Side. The Lower East Side. And I am an optimist that there's a path ahead where this current conflict, and we see that Iran looks so different than it did 4 months ago, 5 months ago, that there's a path ahead with hostages released, with this conflict over, with a circle of peace that's expanded, including the Saudis and other Arab and Muslim states, that I'm hopeful, Startup Nation 2.0, and this will be where on the path that it was on really before Corona, before COVID, and that can continue.
Oh, certainly. I think one of the major lessons has been not to be that reliant on any country, and especially in this case, the United States, for weapons. And I think that you're going to start to see here in Israel major investments into weapons manufacturing. And obviously, once that happens, then the companies are going to start trying to come up with the newest and the best technologies. And once they do, then not only is the Israeli military going to be using them, but like the Israeli startup world does all the time, they're going to be looking to export and then looking to exit. Right. So You're going to start to see this whole new 2.0 where I think Startup Nation 2.0, where Israel actually becomes a military exporter. And I'm sure that there's all kind of other solutions out there. Necessity becomes the mother of invention. Right. And there's a lot of learning that took place during this war.
And add AI to the mix, both the military components of it and the non-military. And AI obviously is the future. And Israel is front and center.
And the prime minister met with Elon Musk on this trip and specifically came back with a report that he said that he wants Israel to become a leading nation in AI.
Right. So I think there's amazing opportunities ahead. So I am optimistic. And I think what those opportunities would be increase Aliyah, God willing.
But the feeling that things might get more difficult again before that optimism at the end, right? It seems like we're sort of in a pause here before the beginning of the fourth quarter.
I mean, as we're recording this, there's a noon Saturday, 12 o'clock Saturday deadline for all the hostages to be released or for hell to be paid.
All hell to break loose.
So, God willing, all hell won't break loose if that's not a good thing. I don't know exactly what all hell breaking loose looks like. But yeah, I think things will be tougher before they get better. I think this fourth quarter, as you put it, between now, the time that all the hostages are freed and Hamas is vanquished and ... there's Saudi normalization. I think that's going to be some months.
Can you feel a tangible difference between what Israel is now working with in a Trump administration compared to what Israel could have been working with if Kamala Harris had won the presidency and brought in a completely different administration? You see the pictures now, the satellite footage, the drone footage from Gaza, and it's only now starting to become clear, what's the true level of devastation inside the Gaza Strip, and the feeling that we were maybe on the pathway toward a complete diplomatic avalanche unlike anything we'd ever seen, and maybe now that avalanche has been averted.
A little bit of a loaded question, Alex. I'd say that I don't know how to compare it to a Harris administration that wasn't. I can compare it to a Biden administration that was. And I'd say that President Biden is a Zionist. President Biden was here for Israel early and throughout the duration of his 60 days of being president during the conflict after October 7th, was mostly very much in the right place. That being said, as you say, there were some times when he wasn't. And the withdrawing, the so-called arms embargo, pressure related to Rafah, pressure related to humanitarian issues, I think was made with the best of intentions by the Biden administration. But clearly there's a new direction with the Trump administration. And it's a direction that sees that the policies that took place in Gaza for decades and took place in the conduct of this conflict have not led to and do not seem to be leading to an end to the intractable conflict. And so by changing the channel, changing the gear, and concomitant with that, giving more green lights for Israel to do what it needs to do, than the sometimes green, sometimes yellow, and occasionally red lights that were coming from the Biden administration.
Aside from the president, there were a lot of public officials that were very critical of Prime Minister Netanyahu during the war. You had Chuck Schumer calling for a new election. You had Hillary Clinton saying that the prime minister is untrustworthy. There was a lot of pressure on the prime minister. And even before the war, I would say among maybe the more progressive wings of the American Jewish establishment, there was a lot of criticism of the prime minister. Have you sensed that there's some sort of change in the views on the prime minister based on how he has managed to conduct this war and get Israel to this point where maybe they're on the cusp of what could be a total victory?
I think that there's been a sea change in the attitude towards the prime minister and the conduct of the war since the pager walkie-talkie episodes. From that moment on, with the assassinations that followed, with the taking out of the Hezbollah missiles and rockets, the greater perception that Israel is the victor and will be the victor has changed attitudes across the board, adjusted attitudes. People want to be with a winner and don't want to be with a loser. And so I think that that attitude is pervading all over. I see it in international affairs with certain countries that after the pagers and walkie-talkies toned down their criticism of Israel, toned down their jumping on board with international condemnation of Israel. And I think in America too, people want to be with a winner. And when it looked like, and we still don't know exactly, I mean, I painted a pretty rosy path for how I'd like for this to go. I certainly wouldn't bet my mortgage. I don't know anybody here who would. But the path that Israel is on now certainly seems much better and much more prone to optimism than the path that Israel was on, say, in July or August.
Now, the Conference of Presidents over the years has really played a role, I think, in paving the path toward optimism. And particularly, we saw in the last Trump administration, Israel was able to broker the Abraham Accords, which came as a big surprise to most, but I think maybe did not come as a big surprise to yourself and other members of the Conference of Presidents who, for many years before coming to Israel on the annual mission, were going to strategic countries around the world, whether it was in the Eastern Med or whether that was in the Arab world and going to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and to Saudi Arabia and Morocco. And literally paving the pathway towards the conversations that ultimately led to these normalization agreements.
Oh, thank you, and absolutely. And my predecessor, Malcolm Hoenlein, a frequent guest here in the JNS studios, really was a path breaker there. He started going to the Gulf in the early 1990s at a time when no one knew about it, and if they had known about it, everybody would have denied it. And those relations continued. We, with the conference, went to Riyadh in right before COVID in February of 2020, as the Abraham Accords were just starting to be talked about and to start engaging in those conversations. And it is really the strength and power of American Jewry and the perception of the strength and power of American Jewry that allow for us to engage in these areas where oftentimes it'd be best for there not to be government-to-government interaction. And it's really
talk a little bit about the perception of the power of American Jewry. Like what do world leaders think when they meet a delegation? Like, I mean, I know a lot of the people that are going on these delegations, and right. They're friends and nice people and good folk. But what do other leaders see when they see this delegation?
David Harris, the former CEO of the American Jewish Committee, used to talk about the double-edged sword of the world thinking that Jews control it. On the one hand, there's obviously the negative, the anti-Semitism that flows from it. If we control the world, then any problems there are flow from us. And it's among the reasons that we are scapegoated and have been scapegoated for centuries because of these canards. On the plus side, David used to say they would have 110 bilateral meetings during the UN General Assembly week, because all of these countries that want to engage with America or diplomatically and internationally will want to meet with the American Jewish community because they think that we have this outsized influence. What we endeavor to do is to first push back against those anti-Semitic canards, but to take that perception and use it for good, for American interests in order to further the foreign policy interests of America, the foreign policy interests of the American Jewish community, to try to solidify the bonds between Israel and those countries, to speak often on behalf of the Jewish communities in those countries who might not have the relations that we have, because we're bringing with us the Statue of Liberty and the White House and Congress when we're talking to these governments. And so it's an art form, and it's something that, as an American, I feel privileged to be an American and to be able to be a part of exerting American influence around the world. And as a Jew, I'm privileged to be able to mold those two together and to be able to leverage the relationships and strengths of the American Jewish community on behalf of world Jewry and Israel.
Now, when you're representing this Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, I think everybody can understand that if you have it's something like 50 organizations, that's 50 organizations and probably 100 different opinions on what should be the priorities.
You're not counting the rabbis in that.
So, how do you navigate that? What's your job as a CEO? How do you create this united front of American Jewry when, I've been in the room when, politicians are speaking, and, a lot of differences of opinion and quite frankly, some people don't like other people and they don't like their belief systems. And people think like Jews are monolithic, but Jews are the exact opposite of monolithic. So, how do you balance all that?
It is an art form, and it is looking for a consensus by finding how to bring about as many win-win situations as we can, where folks around the table are willing to say, I don't need to be 100% right here. I'm okay to be 70%, to get 70% of what I want. And if everybody's okay with 70% or 80%, if everybody's okay with the idea that the policy prescription that's coming out is a positive one, and the idea of there being Jewish unity is a positive one, such that it outweighs the disappointment about not having a total policy agreement, I think that's a win-win. The idea behind the Conference of Presidents, where we can take, as you said, the many disparate non-monolithic views of the American Jewish community and distill them into an agenda, distill them into relationships and conversations on behalf of the Jewish community, I think is of great value in and of itself. And I think we get there. I think for the most part, we get to the point where, if not all the organizations, the vast majority of organizations are supportive of where we come out on these issues. Otherwise, we wouldn't come out on the issues that way.
And do you think this mission is going to have a different tone than not only celebrating the 50th anniversary, but because of where we are in Jewish history than previous missions?
I think that, this is our fourth mission since October 7th. And because we had a emergency mission right after October 7th, we had our annual mission, and then we had a mission on the anniversary of 10/7. And they are very different in tone, in large part because in addition to speaking, as I spoke before, with the political leadership, we're speaking much more with the average everyday Israelis, the people who've been so impacted by this, soldiers, the families of soldiers, hostage families, people who've been evacuated. And so it's much more one-to-one, much more person-to-person in a way that it's very moving. It's to engage with folks who have been so scarred. And in fact, we've all been scarred, and to show our scars together, to learn more, to engage more. And a big piece of it is we all feel so alone as Jews because of the attacks and people not understanding it, because of the anti-Semitism and the Jew hatred, because of people just looking at a CNN report and seeing what seems so self-obvious to us and having the exact opposite view, that by being here to show that you're not alone and we're not alone, it makes for a stronger Jewish world, and it's incredibly fulfilling and different than previous missions.
We have a lot to be proud of, don't we?
We have so much to be proud of as a Jewish people, and we have so much to be proud of here in Israel. The resilience of the Israeli people is amazing. Your soldiers, our soldiers, these kids who are, and not just kids, but the people who are nearly my age and beyond, who have served 200, 300 days in reserve. It's amazing. I was dancing at Shabbat in the Old City, Erev Shabbat, with some friends of ours in the old city with a room full of soldiers. And the spirit, the ruach, the just love of life, and looking around at these kids who are 19, 20, 21 years old, who God knows what they're going to be getting into, and may Hashem guide them and protect them. That spirit is just so strong, and you see that resilience throughout Israel and throughout civil society, and it's amazing to be a part of it.
Well, it's a privilege to support it. William Daroff, the CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. Thanks so much for being with us.
My honor. Thank you, Alex.